everyone, this is Dr. Liz, and you're listening to Include with Dr. Liz. This show is about everyone, all people, including you. It's about people and their diverse lived experience in this world. I chat with guests to get to know them, their identities, and their inclusion needs, so we all have an opportunity to understand how best to include them, so together we can create a world where everyone thrives. Leah is a parent and grandparent who loves horses and hates tapioca. Indigenous and identifying as LGBTQI+, a religious minority with a permanent injury and physical disability, Leah is a lifelong learner who is smart, sensitive, and has a strong sense of justice. Leah is on a mission to facilitate the movement of people into better alignment with themselves, each other, and the planet. Welcome, Leah.
Thank you. It's so good to be here.
Likewise, we've already had a giggle offline. Now, a little birdie told me that you grew up in the inner city as a thug. Come on, really?
Yes, I was actually born into a family where drugs and guns were the family business.
Oh.
So I was a runner at 7, full-blown addict by the time I was 10, taught to steal cars at 15, my contribution to the family business. It also meant that life was hard, right? I lost my mother, 2 brothers and a sister by the time I was about 5, 6 years old, to the violence in the world that was there. It also is reflective of, as a Native American, my mother and my my older brother and sister were all darker skinned than I was. So as I was losing family, it became poignantly obvious that I was accountable. And I was accountable because I am white presenting. Even though I am Native heritage, my father was a white man. As a result, I got lighter skin, which made me more accountable, which meant that that's what saved my life on one hand. It also gave me a really strong idea of what it means to have white privilege and how, as we move through life, what that looks like.
That sounds like a really tough start to life. Now, every guest completes a survey in advance of the podcast, and there was a big long list of identities, and you ticked 6 of them. What were they for you?
So I identify strongly as a woman. I'm a lesbian married to a woman. I am a parent, so we are a blended family of yours, mine, and ours. I identify strongly as Native, both in my culture as well as in my religion, which puts me into a religious minority.
Yep.
And as part of the trauma of growing up, I had a traumatic brain injury, which left me with a seizure disorder. And I use a service dog moving through the world. And which is always interesting because that carries its own layers, right? Because I'm on dog number 7. She's my first little dog. She's a 15-pound dog. Prior to that, they were all big dogs. Think 80 to 140 pounds, right? People have a prejudice against small service dogs. They're like, is that really a service dog? Wink, 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 right? I mean, it's just fascinating. So yeah, having the opportunity to be able to layer those identities creates the opportunity to laugh a lot.
I mean, if you didn't laugh, what would you do?
Right, exactly. And if you can't laugh, why bother, right? So it also provides a really great opportunity for other people to tell you their experiences, their stories, it turns into this kind of a almost a support group, right? With strangers. So it actually has a lot of advantages in a lot of ways.
So that support dog doesn't realize it's not just supporting you, but it is an icebreaker to creating inclusive conversations with other people.
She is. And I laugh because she's my service dog and I'm her emotional support human. So
I think she needs a pay rise.
That's right.
Probably wasn't in her job description. I can tell we're going to have fun today. Now, you already said about the layering of identities. That is unique to you. But I'll also say before we get started, well, unique to you, there'll be others like you. And so by learning how to best include you, we learn how to include others like you as well. So really thank you for being here today. I do want to start with drilling in a little to your Indigenous identity. And for those listening, the reason that I'll say Indigenous is because this is a global podcast. And Indigenous populations around the world do slightly identify differently. Some will say First Nations, some will say Aboriginal, some will say Indigenous. So I just use Indigenous as more of a generic description. In this case, we're talking about Native American. So I heard that you are first generation to break the cycle of abuse in your family and the first person to go to college. What did it take for you to break that cycle?
Allies.
Haha. Tell us about it.
Inner city high schools really, particularly then, were more about warehouses. They at least knew where we were for a couple hours a day. And there was no emphasis on education as any kind of a value within my family. Mm-hmm. My father's family is Appalachian. So between Appalachian and Native, you're in abject poverty, right? And as far as you're concerned, that's where you're staying. So that whole idea of reaching for something more was not something that was supported in my family. I was a sophomore in high school when the guidance counselor, I didn't even know we had one, I'm just going to say that, hunted me down and said, I want to see you in my office. Didn't know I had one, didn't know where our office was. So ultimately she sat me down and she said, you took your SATs and you scored, higher than a lot of our seniors, and I'd like to put you in this advanced English class. And of course, I'm the thug going, what are you doing to me? You're going to trash my reputation. You're going to leave me high and dry. What are you trying to do here? And she's like, no, we're going to work through this together. And ultimately, it was that English class, that English teacher in particular. She held my writing up as exemplars and said, this is what I want. Right. So for the first time in my life, I had somebody who was saying, look at her, good, not look at her, smart ass. Right. So it's that idea of all of a sudden I was being raised up. At the same time, then, as the end of the year came or end of the semester came around, she said, we have this research project. You're going to research a foreign country. I'd never been outside of my neighborhood. And this is long before Google. Right.
Yeah.
You go into the library and you've got these drawers, these little tiny drawers, right? And I'm like, what? And she spent hours with me teaching me how to use that Dewey Decimal System, the library system. And she opened doors for me I didn't even know existed.
I just had a flashback of microfiche.
Yes.
Do you remember what microfiche was?
Yes, the little thing, and you gotta keep moving stuff through, and you're like, and it wasn't us. It's like, I can see it over here, but how come I can't see it over? Yes. Oh yeah.
Our younger listeners will be like,
I know, right?
Is that like a snack?
For those of you who are dying to look it up, it's micro, M-I-C-R-O-O, or R-O, and fish, F-I-S-C-H-E. Yes. So go look that up. Then they started talking about, I was smart enough to go to college, right? And so it was through their mechanisms that I was able to get a scholarship and begin to make that trajectory. There are two really important things I want to point out. One, it was not a straight shot. I married my dealer, seemed like a really good idea at the time. I mean, all of those kinds of things, right? So it's not like it was like, poof, I was cured, quote unquote, right? It was this jaggedy little trail but somebody lit me, right? Somebody said you can. And the other thing I want to point out is that my best friend was African American. She was Black, and she was as smart as I am, but nobody offered her the same thing. So we're looking at that white privilege. We're looking at that I am white presenting, right? I'm Native by birth. I am Native by culture. I am Native by religion. But I am white presenting. When I walk into a room, people see a white woman. And that advantage became poignantly obvious to me at a very early age. So that's that idea of the recognition of my privilege on top of, right, my target experience. And so because it's a relationship, and I needed an ally, right, in terms of getting out. Yeah. But I also learned from that example that I can be an ally. And the duality of that relationship within myself, right? It's like I need somebody who can be my ally, and oh, let me be your ally, right?
Yes.
And so it's that dance that I really learned at a very, very young age because of that experience.
Yeah, wonderful. Now, there's so many things that I want to revisit in the story that you just told. Which one will we start with? I think I'll ask first about the importance of scholarships. Could you have gone to college without it?
No, I
No.
couldn't even have thought about it. I
Mm.
mean, who was going to pay for it? Drug dealing might have. I mean, there's a real misnomer that drug dealing actually makes you a lot of money. But even if I could have made my way that way, how successful would I have been at college if that's how I was making my money, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, no, there would have been no access without scholarships. There would have been no access without Pell Grants, right? All of those things that were in place that helped me have that leg up.
I love that you highlighted that it took someone to tell you that you could, someone to believe in you to say you can. Because I hear all too often the stories of, well, they told me I couldn't, so I cracked on and I did. And those are great overcoming adversity stories. But I think that really, wouldn't it be better to have people saying, I believe in you and you can? And there's a whole bunch of us that need people to believe in us before we'll believe in ourselves. So I am grateful to your ally, as I'm sure you are, but that's brought us to where we are to have this conversation today.
Especially for people who have historical trauma, right? The that history, right? Indigenous people have been oppressed since white people showed up, and right, so there's this generational exacerbation of
Yeah.
I can't, of you won't, of right. And so it does take somebody, and it often takes somebody of the privileged class, right, to be able to stand in front of you and say, yes, you can. Because, you know, I tell my children all the time, right, you can do this, and they're like, yeah, but you're my mom. Right? I mean, how much weight does that carry, right? So
None, unfortunately.
right? And so that recognition of how important it is for those of us who have the opportunity to be mentors, to be somebody who's standing in the wings of any kind of event, going, oh my goodness, look at you, aren't you amazing? And it takes 5 seconds.
Yeah.
And it can change a life. All the way back to that ally back here in high school that I had that voice in the back of my head that said, you really can. And that was the spark that allowed me to really be able to step into that moment and go, but maybe, maybe I can do this differently, right? And so that idea of how much impact that has, and none of us knows how strongly we can impact someone in that simple moment.
I'm really fortunate that my best friend of 40 years is Aboriginal. So she's Australian Indigenous person. There is a privilege in that for me because I've learned so much about it. I understand the history and the oppression and the kind of legacy that it leaves in a person's life. And I think she also is carries white privilege with her as well. So I think the two of you would have a lot in common. In fact, you probably should meet. But where I was going with that is it means that I have developed a level of respect for, let's call it the baggage that you bring with you. So I'm acutely aware of it. How important do you think it is for people to be educated and understand about the history and the experience of oppression of Native Americans?
This can be a really sore spot, partly because, especially in the United States, when we talk about race, it's a conversation about black and white. And there's so much more in there. While I don't want to get into oppression Olympics, I mean, that's useless, right? It's a useless conversation. At the same time, the contrast of dynamics between how Indigenous people here were treated and how African Americans were treated, right? And slavery was awful, genocide is bad, right? It's like there's no way to say one is worse than the other, right? At the same time, genocide means there's only 3 to 4% of Native Americans left in the American population, while within the African American community, those numbers are significantly higher. When we begin to recognize those kinds of impacts, I think of COVID. And because of the poverty of Native Americans, because of the lack of access to healthcare, because families live in close proximity to each other, right? COVID hit hard in the Native American community. We lost elders. We lost wisdom. We lost, historical knowledge again. And so those kinds of impacts, when we begin to look at how they're different, not how they're better or worse, but how they're different, it begins to raise questions that are different than some of the typical race questions that we ask.
Mm-hmm.
And it starts to drive us into different solutions that are broader. It's one of my complaints around the word racism, right? We have racism, but it's different, and it has a different face based on who's standing there. And that's true within, I can use my own example, right? My family that is darker skinned, looks more native, has a totally different experience than I do, right? So I think it begins to be really important to begin to understand those individual experiences as a broader sense of what racism really is and the impact.
And if I was to add to that as well, you're talking about the different color of skin, so how people present, but your experience growing up as an Indigenous person in the city is going to be different to someone you're in a reservation, right? Those experiences are all going to be different, which really highlights for people the complexity of diversity. And I'm going to say, the reason I paused there is I don't believe inclusion's complex. So diversity is complex, because when we take you, for instance, and your 6 ticked identities, you're not just Native American, but you're female and identify as lesbian, and you're married and a parent and a grandparent with lived experience and a disability, a religious minority. If we only look at one little part of you with a pride program or an Indigenous program, we're missing the whole picture of you and how we include you. So how about we dig in a little to looking at how we include someone like you so you can thrive. Now, we came up with scholarship programs for education, giving people opportunity to move out of their current state. Let's stick with that phase of your life. What supports did you have or could you have benefited from?
So I was extremely fortunate in some ways. By the time I got back to college, remember I married my dealer, I had 2 kids, I got rid of my dealer, and now I have to go back to school and I'm a single parent, right?
Yep.
So I'm in the welfare system. The welfare system was a system that gave me a leg out because it helped to provide me with daycare so my kids were taken care of while I went to school. It helped to provide me with money for the extras, like my books. And the other thing is that having a disability, we're way more disability aware now than we were back then. So the negotiation, and I can't tell you the number of times I've been someplace, walked in with a dog, and somebody said, "You can't bring that dog in here." And you're like, "But I can." And even though federal law is on my side, I've been kicked out of everything from, restaurants and airports as well as hotels. And I mean, so the list goes on, right? And so recognizing how crucial that service dog is, it's my lifeline. Without that dog, I can't go anywhere. She's why I can drive. She's why I have my independence. She's why I could parent my children, right? And so that recognition, and it's not the soft and cuddly, can I pet your dog? It must be so nice to take your dog everywhere. You have no idea.
So let's help people. Because if I was just to make an assumption, and assumptions are very dangerous when we're talking about inclusion, but if I was to make an assumption, I'm guessing that maybe your dog is trained to sense when a seizure might be coming on?
Yes, so she gives me 12 to 15-minute warning before a seizure.
Okay.
So like when I'm driving, I have enough time to pull over. Otherwise, I have no notice. I have no way to know that it's coming. And so she is crucial in that environment as a single parent, right? The ability to be able to say to my kids, "Okay, why don't you guys go play in your room for a few minutes," right? So those kinds of things that I could negotiate because I had that service dog. And when you walk into school to go for your parent teacher conferences, and you've got administration and or security standing there going, you can't bring that dog in here, right? Those kinds of things that are like, really, we have to have this conversation because you didn't educate yourself about a federal law that's been in place for quite some time now. And it became a habit, right? I walked around with papers going, yes, I can here. I was fortunate that as a single mom, right? So your kid comes home with chicken pox. What's inevitable? The next kid has chicken pox, right? So how long are you out of class? And this is before virtual was even an option, right? So now I have to go to the professor and say, I was out for 2 weeks worth of class because my kids had chicken pox. What can we do to negotiate this? How do I, right? And so that idea of single parenthood and the burden that falls to me as the single parent to be able to negotiate those things, to be able to walk in and have the brass cojones, right? To be able to sit down with a professor and say, look, dude, because otherwise you don't pass.
I remember you've given me a flashback to I fell pregnant when I was 21, and I had one of my final year exams for one of my subjects at university, and I mean I really didn't like the subject as it was. There's about 300 of us going into the huge hall, and they pass you a number so that you can all go to a different table. And as I get past the number, I saw the professor standing there, and I was really morning sick. Like I was vomiting multiple times a day at this stage. And I've looked at her, and I clearly looked terrible. She said, "Are you okay?" And I've gone, and I think if I'd just gone and said, "Oh, I'm pregnant, I don't feel very well," I wouldn't have got any leniency. But because I threw up on timber floorboards and it sprayed all over everybody, they let me do the exam a few weeks later. I mean, there are certain ways that you can get your accommodations made.
And some are more desirable than others.
I'm not making light, but it just means that we all have these ridiculous experiences of having to fight against systems, particularly when we're talking back in the 80s and 90s. Mm-hmm. So socially, you did what thought was right and you married a man. Unfortunately, he happened to be your dealer, but let's just leave that to the side for the time being. At what point did you come into identifying your own sexuality?
Before I married him.
Leah.
And the entire time I was with him, all I kept thinking was, this has got to be better with a woman. Really strong indicators, right? True to form, he was abusive, so I ultimately ended up leaving. My kids were 2.5 and 1 at the time, and it took me approximately 2 months to be in my first relationship with a woman. So,
is there any additional stigmas within the Native American community and being queer, or within the LGBTQI community?
It really depends on the circles you fly in. And if you look at Native American history, it was not necessarily something new, right? It didn't just show up in recent culture, right? It's been around a long time. I'm going to say something that will not necessarily be popular. There has been much of the religion of the oppressor has become the religion of the oppressed. And Christianity is oftentimes the culprit, or identified as the culprit, of why it can't be tolerated. That piece of it is where I see the stigma that begins to show up within Native culture. Mm-hmm. I also want to point out that when I came out and with my small children, I was a teacher. And I worked in many, many school systems where it was not okay to be gay. And so teaching my children the difference between privacy and secrecy, right? We don't keep secrets, but there are things we keep private. As my son has a small gay flag in the back window going, "My mom's a lesbian, my mom's a lesbian," right? And I'm like, okay, that's great in the car, but now let's have this conversation about out at large, right? Because that was still when, I mean, for instance, many of us wore lambdas, which is, the Greek L, to be able to identify each other. And so there was a whole lot of stigma outside of me and outside of my culture that was bigger than anything else I was managing. Remember too that I couldn't get married in this country legally. I was in Washington State in 2013 when it was legalized, and that's when I and my wife got married.
Mm-hmm.
Even though we've been together for over 20 years. So that recognition of how all of those things, right? Everything that kind of like spider webs into each other and snags and tangles and then, leaves some things hanging. So it's an interesting intersectionality when you look at the Indigenous, but even the female, right? And all of that movement stuff. And to be honored to have been in this community for as long as I have, right? I've watched the shift of trans rights and the ebb and flow of trans and LGBT rights, right? But so there's a lot of history in those of us who have been around for a while.
You referenced the ebb and flow of LGBTQI and trans rights. And I know what you mean, but not everyone's going to know what you mean. So can you explain that to us and how that impacts you?
We are in an era where LGBT is recognized and it is in most cases okay, if not cool, right? At the same time, I have lived through the experience where literally outside of one of the bars that I went to, 2 lesbian women were executed in their pickup truck, right? So we're talking life and death. We're not talking about just whether or not it's comfortable. So as Roe versus Wade, right, came off the table, so to speak, now all of a sudden gay marriage is something that's on the table and on the chopping block, right? And so there's this just because it's been given doesn't mean it isn't going to be taken away. We see trans rights happening in much the same way, right? It's for every battle that's been won, there have been just as many that have been lost. We're still in the war in some ways, but I really wish we'd figure ourselves out and just kind of step into being respectful. I don't have to like you. I don't have to accept you. I don't even have to know you to be respectful. And if we could do something as simple as replace the concept of patriotism with the concept of respect. So in order to be a patriot, you have to be respectful. Imagine the change that we could have across an entire continent. I mean, that would be amazing.
You said before about being Native American, it kind of defaults puts you into a religious minority as well. So when you're living in a country that operates off a Christian calendar and subscribes to that calendar, how does that impact you and your ability to, I don't know, follow your faith?
I spent a long time being what I would consider a solo practitioner. The earth is a sentient being. It's sacred, right? So we'll come off of Christmas. Why do you cut Christmas trees down? Right? You just killed a being.
Yeah.
Those kinds of things that are much more the conflict for me than the actual calendar.
Where do you feel most included and how do you know you're included?
I think I learned a long time ago that if you wait to be included, it doesn't happen. So I start including. I create my own worlds, right? I'm like, I go and I take people with me who are going to be what I need.
Okay, so park that thought.
Okay.
Let's think of your identity, Leah, without the absolutely astounding self-efficacy that you have in yourself and the courage that you have to create that space and to have those conversations, because not everyone like you carries that with them.
Right.
So if someone like you was in the room and I could sense that something wasn't quite right and that they weren't being included, what do you think the advice would be from you to me and what I could do to make someone like you feel like they belong and that they're valued?
So if you're an equal, sometimes it's something as simple as, hey, you want to grab coffee? Or it's, I think about being in conferences, and I've been in enough conferences where I'm the only, I sit down at a table and no one sits with you. Right? It's something as simple as someone who sits down next to you and says, hey, my name is, how are you? Right? Those kinds of things that I think go a long way in that inclusion component. And it takes noticing. That's the piece of it, I think. When when people are in groups, we're often so self-conscious that we forget to look outside of ourselves. And I think that that's the first step in inclusion, is going, scan the room.
Look, it's clear we could talk forever, but we have certainly gone beyond the 30 minutes of recording time. But one thing I want to finally sum up with is the point that you said, is that the first step to inclusion is awareness, is actually just take yourself out of yourself for the moment and look around, pay attention, and then you'll start to open your eyes onto the needs of others. So what is it that you do in this world? How do you bring your superpowers to life?
I am a professional development trainer, as well as a coach and consultant around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I teach the tools of respect and belonging, which gets us to justice and dignity without having to challenge what we think and believe, and instead creating connection.
I just want to reach through and give you a hug. Just for everyone listening, I'm going to put all of your contact details in the description of the podcast so that people can reach out to you if they'd like to connect.
Definitely.
Thank you so much for your time, Leah. I mean, an absolute joy.
I've enjoyed it too, and I'm looking forward to coffee. Let me know when you're coming.
Guaranteed.
Awesome.